All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining JINSA for this afternoon's webinar, where we'll be discussing recent reports of electronic warfare interfering with commercial and civilian air flights around the Middle East and Europe. I'm Blaise Mishtal, JINSA's Vice President for Policy. I'm delighted to be joined by two expert pilots and experts on the regions that we'll be discussing as well. Lieutenant General Thomas Bergeson and Lieutenant General Joseph Guastella, both alumni of JINSA's General and Admiral's program to Israel, sporting the appropriate attire. Thank you very much. So recent reports, I think most notably in the New York Times last week, have referred to incidents in which pilots flying around the Middle East and Europe have found that their navigational systems were not working for any of a variety of reasons. And this has been attributed to the rise of the use of electronic warfare in conflicts like that going on in Ukraine and Israel at the moment. So to learn more about what is going on, how much of a threat this might pose to civilian air traffic, and what can be done about it, we're delighted to be joined by Lieutenant General Thomas Bergeson, retired from the U.S. Air Force as Deputy Commander of U.S. Central Command, a graduate of the Air Force Academy. He's a pilot who flew F-15s, the F-22, and the A-10, as well as Lieutenant General Joseph Guastella, also of the Air Force, retired as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Headquarters, U.S. Air Force. Also a pilot, flew the F-16 and the A-10, if I have that right. So, generals, thank you so much for joining us. I guess I just wanted to start by asking, how common is it for conflicts more generally to interfere with civilian and commercial air traffic? General Guastella?
Yeah, no, thanks, Blaise. And thanks for having both of us on here. And it's great to be part of the JINSA team. So I would say, anytime there's a conflict, it affects civilian and commercial traffic. And because the entire airspace system is predicated upon the most fuel efficient routing. So anytime there's a conflict, airliners will have to avoid those areas, and they do. And generally, many times it's not even perceivable to the folks on board. But in the case that we see here, jamming can affect the navigational solutions. But so I would say that it is common for airliners to route themselves around conflict areas. They've been doing that for years, but we're seeing certainly an increase in the effect that the jamming is having on them.
General Bergeson, has electronic warfare specifically caused issues in previous conflicts, or is this a relatively new phenomenon that we're seeing now?
I know this has been, first of all, thank you. And it's an honor and privilege to be here with my good friend, Gus Guastella, and the JINSA team. So thanks for the invitation. Though this has been around for a while. Let me go back just real quick to cut my resume. One of the things that I did before I was the Deputy Commander of CENTCOM, I was the commander of 7th Air Force on the Korean Peninsula, where we've had during my tenure, a number of incidents of the North Koreans doing similar jamming that we're seeing in Ukraine and elsewhere today, that was interrupting both civilian and military flight traffic. But if I could give you maybe just a 1-minute primer, if you will, on the GPS, navigation systems. It's part of the larger global navigation satellite system. That's the, kind of the international one, if you will. That's all the different countries that have similar capabilities that are on orbit. The GLONASS is the one that the Russians use. Galileo is used by the EU, and then GPS is the one used by the United States. And for many of you that don't know this, it's owned by the U.S. government, GPS is, but it's actually flown by the former U.S. Air Force and now U.S. Space Force. And so, yes, you have 18 to 21-year-old airmen that are flying the GPS constellation as we speak and doing a great job. And, it's kind of become a ubiquitous free good for everybody. The things that GPS provides is obviously the positioning and the navigation capability, but also exquisite timing capability, down to like 10 nanoseconds that is used by every ATM machine, every kind of credit card transaction requires and needs that specialized timing. So not just interrupting, civilian air traffic potentially, but a lot of other impacts that it could have when those signals are jammed. Those signals, all the constellations largely operate in the L band, which is, I'm not a electrical engineer, but I think it's like the 1500 megahertz range. So they all operate in the same sort of frequency band as they emit their signals. You need like 4 satellites to be able to figure out a location and timing. And what we're seeing with this jamming is that you'll see some kind of broad-based jamming in that frequency band that just prevents the reception of those signals from the aircraft that are in the area of interest or where the jamming is occurring. So I think interestingly, in 1983 is when President Reagan opened up GPS to the civilian world, because before that it was just for military needs. And they did that because of the Korean airliner that had accidentally flown into Soviet airspace, and on 1 September 1983 was shot down by the Soviets. And because of that, we opened up GPS, hoping that it would be a better system, and it clearly has turned out to be a better system. But it does have its disadvantages that we see. So in my experience in Korea, again starting in 2016, but have been going on for several years prior. Regularly, we would see the North Koreans, who were located obviously very close to the two major airports in Seoul, would turn on these kinds of broad-based jamming systems. Some of them are, big truck-mounted systems, very high power. Others are very small. You can buy them at a Radio Shack, and they cause sufficient interference that it makes it difficult for those airplanes to navigate successfully. Now, as Gus and I will talk about, there's other backup systems that you utilize for navigation besides just GPS. But yeah, it does cause problems with the civilian air traffic. And for the reason they're doing that is, one, to be disruptive for civilian air traffic, but also to try to have a military aircraft that's operating close to the border of North Korea wander north and create some sort of incident that they can take advantage of. And so we're always very mindful of it there. But that happens quite regularly and has happened for some time. And I'll turn it over to Gus.
No, that's a great answer, Guns, and I don't have anything else to add to that. And I'll let Blaze keep going, but go ahead, Blaze.
So General Bergeson mentioned GPS jamming. According to the stories that have come out, some of the aircraft more recently have experienced GPS spoofing. General Guastella, can you sort of explain what the difference between those two different types of interference are?
Yeah, well, the difference between jamming and spoofing is simple. Jamming, basically, like Guns just said, jamming denies the signal. So if you were previously receiving the signal, it's denied. You're not getting it anymore. So you're starved of the signal. Spoofing is much more advanced. Spoofing would actually be to capture the signal, reprocess it, and then retransmit it so it's a believable signal that then could drive you into a different conclusion about where you are or the timing. That's much more advanced, and that's generally. I would be dubious of reports of that spoofing, unless you have equipment designed to determine exactly what's going on. It's more challenging. An airliner probably can't figure that out. An airliner is going to see degradation. It's going to see that they're not there's differences between the navigational solution being provided by GPS and the navigational solution provided by the onboard, what's called an INS, internal navigation system. And just for awareness, most airliners have multiple inertial navigation systems, which is redundancy. But what's historically been the case is GPS is the gold standard of positional accuracy. And so the INS is often graded against the GPS, where the GPS is the gold standard. So what happens is, when the gold standard is denied or spoofed, like as we talk about, then if your algorithm doesn't discount or devalue the GPS signal, it can cause problems, and that's exactly what we have. And a lot of the airliners, as a matter of fact, since this came up, I talked to a few airline buddies. The signal they often get is a reduced navigational performance, and when they have a reduced navigational performance, it basically says, hey, we can't fly some of the approaches that we would normally use, and that causes air traffic control disruption because they can't sequence the airliners as closely as they would under normal circumstances. And so that's just some context there. But spoofing is much more advanced. Spoofing is like Guns was saying, there's different levels of jammers. There's, you can go out and buy one, with a Radio Shack, kind of capability. But you could also have a state actor like a Russia, China, that actually tries to build a much more advanced system, which, like Gunn said, in theory, could drive someone to navigate across a border. But that's pretty advanced and pretty rare.
Do you have a sense of what sort of risks or threats this exposure to jamming or potentially spoofing poses to air traffic around the Middle East or Europe? Is it just sort of that problem of how airplanes are stacked coming into landing, or are there some greater threats here as well?
Well, and I'll let Guns comment on this, but really briefly. So up until now, there wasn't, like I said, GPS was the gold standard and people just would believe it. Now there's a FCA, a flight crew information file, which basically says it's an alert to all the pilots out there. I'm sure every airline is put that out, that says be aware of GPS jamming in these regions. So pilots are aware, and so right off the bat, a good pilot, which hopefully our U.S. carriers certainly are aware that could happen, and then also able then to make adjustments in terms of what they would experience. But I wouldn't think it is not disrupting a lot of air traffic right now because, again, if there's a conflict, which is where most of these jammers are, we're talking Syria with the Russians, and Guns detailed what the North Koreans are doing. Airliners don't fly over conflict zones. That you're just not going to drive over that. So I wouldn't say there's a big effect right now, but if someone does a pop-up stuff, they put stuff outside of JFK or Dulles, that could affect traffic in the sequencing like I was describing before. And Guns, feel free to, jump in.
Great answer, Gus. I would say that is beyond a nuisance. It's more than just a nuisance, because it can be disruptive. I mean, the air traffic systems of the world have become very reliant on GPS. And as we've been able to reduce the clearances and altitude of aircraft as a result of better GPS navigation, as well as things like ADS-B, airplanes are flying closer and closer than they had historically because of, airspace congestion and the need to do so. So, if we're aware that the jamming is occurring, which we normally are, and we can put out these notice to airmen so that they're witting when they go into an area like that, then they can be, looking for a deviation that doesn't make sense. And quite honestly, as Gus said, all these modern airplanes have both the GPS as well as an inertial navigation system, which is organic to the aircraft and does not rely on a GPS signal for its navigation. So it can see if there's a delta emerging there, and it can pick the right one. And then there's other navigation systems they use as they're coming into land that are kind of not jammable, if you will, from that perspective. So there are definitely precautions and safety measures they can take to do so safely, but it's more than just a nuisance. It can be disruptive, with the amount of traffic in some of these locations.
Do you have a sense whether some of what is being reported is maybe intentional interference along the lines of what you said the North Koreans were up to, General Bergeson, or is it sort of spillover from these conflicts and military applications of electronic warfare?
It's a great question. I would say in the North Korea instance, it's a little bit unique because I think it was intentional. They were trying to create some disruption for South Korean commerce, a provocation that's been going on since the 50s, right? Another way of doing it, as well as sort of spillover effect from trying to do GPS jamming on military aircraft. But in these specific conflict zones, as Gus was mentioning, in Syria and the Middle East, as we're seeing now, and in Ukraine and the surrounding areas, it's spillover. They're not focused on trying to disorient airliners. They're focused on trying to jam jam, GPS weapons and other military systems that use it for exquisite navigation. And because it's mostly just broad jamming, very loud barrage jamming, it covers a very big distance, and that area would impact the civilian flights in that region. But I don't think they're intentionally going after civilians in this case, but it is sort of collateral damage, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and if you could, Blaze, that's exactly right, guys. And I could pitch in on that. So the interesting thing about this kind of jamming, and it's by the way, it's not unlike other forms of jamming. Like there's folks out there that try to do satcom jamming, jam satellite signals, right? And the interesting thing about this is that it is a way to disrupt without attribution. You're not shooting a live bullet from North Korea into South Korea, but you're causing an effect. And it without the attribution, hey, it wasn't us, right? You can't, no one is able to be blamed for these effects. And just like a cyber attack is very difficult to attribute and therefore hold someone responsible. A kinetic attack is usually very easy to see and attribute. And so it's a way to less powerful actors. Could be terrorist organizations. It could be anyone that's out there to try to create some leverage against a bigger system. Something that's it's an Achilles. It's I wouldn't say it's an Achilles heel, but it is a vulnerability that we have to deal with nefarious actors.
How widespread is the use of some of these jammers outside of active conflict zones? For example, General Bergeson, you mentioned North Korea, which is not an active conflict. Are there places in the Middle East where there's sort of jamming going on a regular basis, regardless of whether there's active fighting going on, or is this sort of centralized right now on Ukraine and Israel in your opinion?
I think anywhere where there's not maybe active conflict, but the potential for that. So Iran, for example, and Gus can talk about this, but they're actively doing GPS jamming probably on a daily basis, right? And we're not in a conflict necessarily with Iran per se, but they are China all along their border with other our surveillance airplanes that fly in legal airspace outside of their 12 nautical mile zone. You'll see it. So I'd say it's very widespread. I would say within the United States, sometimes we do it to ourselves a little bit. We have our own military training exercises, and every now and again there is spillover that happens, and we try to be very careful with that. It's not good, but it does happen occasionally where you can kind of have this sort of fratricide, if you will, on the electromagnetic spectrum. There's a number of things that can cause different interference with civilian navigation. We won't get into wind farms now, but that's something that can very be disruptive with navigation systems. I mean, there's a lot of this kind of EMI, electrical magnetic interference that occurs globally every day. It's not just restricted to hot combat areas.
You mentioned there being a range of capabilities out there in terms of sort of jamming and then spoofing at the very high end. Um, are these capabilities, especially at the higher end, reserved only for sort of high level state actors? I know you mentioned the Chinese and the Russians. Is this something that, for example, Hamas could be using, could have capabilities as part of its current war with Israel?
Uh, yeah, I'll let Guns pitch in as well afterwards, but absolutely, a violent extremist organization will go to any measure they can to survive a little longer or to disrupt. And so I would say what you'd see at a more low end actors is low end capability, but it has an effect because, like for example, we've seen a proliferation of I would say low end drones throughout the Ukrainian battle space. And a low end system is just that. It's inexpensive, but therefore it's not exquisitely hardened in terms of its navigation solutions. It doesn't have the mil spec GPS. And as a result, could be a low end drone, something you could buy off the shelf, is much more susceptible to jamming. And so if it gives you an advantage against that kind of a threat, that's exactly the kind of actor that would put that out there. And that's the proliferation that I think we've seen a lot, is just protect against that low end stuff that we can protect against. Russia, China level folks, they're going to want to try to target our more high end military systems, and they'll go after those directly. And of course, there are ways to counter that. We spent billions of dollars to put that kind of capability on orbit, which involves encryption of the signals to make the signals less susceptible to jamming, and certainly to spoofing. But it is a very widespread problem, and I think it's really an answer to how effective those low end drones are right now, flying around the battle space. You can't hide in the battle space these days with just being seen by something low end, which relies on GPS. And if you can put jammers out there, it affords you a little more protection.
Yeah, I would say, without having any of the classified information on the order of battle in Gaza, 100% that Hamas is using GPS jammers, 100%, and that
Yeah.
Hezbollah has them and has them turned on. They're absolutely. And maybe some of them are, not that sophisticated, but they're still, impactful because they're very, very powerful. And there's every chance that they could get some more exquisite capability from a country like Iran if they wanted to get that to them, the kind of potential spoofing capability. But I don't know that they would target, airliners flying into Tel Aviv, directly. They're more concerned right now with trying to spoof a GPS guided munition, coming from the IDF, which is so that you would have some spillover into in Tel Aviv, given the size.
Are you able to speak at all about the U.S. Military experience with dealing with adversaries with electronic warfare capabilities and the CENTCOM AOR and sort of recent history? Is it something that in fighting Al Qaeda or ISIS that we encountered, or was it more when we sort of rubbed up against Iran and Russia and Syria? Was that an issue? Are you able to give us any insights, generals?
Yeah, I mean, I could share just basics of it all, and that is absolutely various airframes experienced GPS type of jamming, or what I described before, which was SATCOM jamming, and the military, while we have modes of GPS that are less susceptible to jamming, there have been some effects. I would say those effects are much greater when you're dealing with a state actor. Like when Russia came into Syria, they brought in a level of technology that would never be seen by low end Al Qaeda, ISIS level players. Same with the Iranian proxies. I mean, Iran has given things to Hezbollah, and I'm sure into Hamas at this point, that they could never have developed on their own. But so certainly, yes, the military has, but the military also has, be as very aware of it. We have a job to do, and we have, tactics, techniques, and procedures, as well as technology to try to mitigate that. And I think we've been successful, very successful so far. But it's absolutely a threat.
I mean, and I know Gus and I personally we've flown in, combat operations over Iraq, for example, and experienced GPS jamming on us or members of our formations. And then he commanded obviously all the air forces in Central Command, and so his forces saw that daily in Syria and other locations. And there's a lot of different, ways that, from a military perspective, we learn to mitigate the effects of GPS jamming, although it can be very problematic. This is something that the government, the military takes very seriously to keep advancing the ball on capabilities because of the ease with which you can acquire some of these GPS jammers. But a laser guided bomb doesn't care about GPS jamming, so that's a pretty good alternative if you need to. But yeah, we've both experienced it personally, and then led forces that have been under that threat.
So thank you. So I have a couple more questions, and then I want to throw it open to the audience for any questions they have. So if you do want to ask General Bergeson or Guastella anything, you can do that using the Q&A chat feature. Type in your question, and then we'll pose it to the generals. So I wanted to ask sort of about where we go from here, or countermeasures. You referred to some of the higher quality protections that military hardware has. But going back to the civilian and commercial air traffic that might be suffering from this, are there any solutions that might be considered to protect them, or is this sort of a stay away from hot zones as the best we can do?
Well, and Guns can speak to this too. So both of us were flying well before GPS was ever out there, and guess what? It worked just fine. So we don't need GPS to fly airplanes. We don't need GPS to bomb targets and or supply civilian airliners. But over the years, they realized that the GPS signal was such a phenomenal way to create very precise navigation at zero cost. By the way, we the big mistake was we never charged a tax for GPS. And had the Department of Defense charged a 1 penny tax to every GPS user, we could have funded our military probably, 10 times over. But that's a different story. So it's a free service that everyone at the time wasn't being interfered with, and did phenomenally well. And everyone uses it now for all those efficiencies in terms of aircraft separation, banking, everything else. And so, but what now the technology, though, is the fact that if you are reliant on an external signal like GPS, if you're relying on satellite communications, it is a vulnerability for your system. And so the technology now is they've been seeking it for quite some time, is to create the GPS quality location and timing solution without any external signal. And think like we have what we were just like Guns and I were describing before. There's an internal navigation system in the airplane. It's just not as accurate as GPS. But if you can make it more and more accurate using, atomic clock level technology, which is out there, you can actually create a GPS level solution without any signal. And so that's the direction that technology is going, is basically to reduce the dependence on those kind of signals, and then that basically cuts off that avenue of attack. But we're a ways away from that. The military obviously is going to be closer for things like that, but it'll eventually trickle down to the rest of the community. I would say this though: the one thing that number one is the awareness throughout the aviation community, civilian, commercial, military, that this jamming is out there. Number one is the awareness, so you don't just blindly trust instruments all the time, that you're at least paying attention, and that is occurring. And then now is going to be improved algorithms in the airplanes that are out there to take everything with a grain of salt, so that navigation solutions are going to be effective despite the potential of jamming.
Is this something where sort of cooperation with our allies and partners to come up with solutions is sort of important on a technological basis, or is there sort of a political solution to come up with some sort of rules and regulations about how electronic warfare is used in these conflict zones, not to have this spillover, or is it sort of a strict technological solution is sort of the best avenue?
There's a number of international laws, that ostensibly prohibit this, right? It's hard to enforce those necessarily in a combat zone, but there is international law and ICAO, which is the Civilian Aviation Organization standards about about the use of these sorts of jammers, and so that does exist, and that's not unimportant. But I think on a multinational level, cooperation with developing these types of technologies that Gus was talking about, where internal to your aircraft, you have exquisite position navigation and timing, and you're not relying on an external source, is really where, we're moving. And so again, I don't have any access into the current research and development processes going on inside the Air Force, but I'm confident they're cooperating with our key allies and in doing that technical development. And as often happens, the military will probably be the leader here on developing something that's going to cost probably quite a bit of money to develop from a research and development perspective. But once it gets fielded and scaled, then it'll matriculate into the civilian communities, much like GPS has. Really, that's the coin of the realm, is to try to decouple from a signal that you're relying on. INS, Inertial Navigation System, which Gus talked about, we've used for years and years and years, well before GPS, is just a set of gyros that are spinning in the airplane, and they know exactly where they're at when you start up the airplane. And so when the airplane moves, it just keeps track of that movement, and it derives your current location. The problem with it, it can drift over time, so it can become less and less and less accurate over time unless you give it updates frequently to kind of snap it back to where it's at. In GPS, you don't need to do that. However, GPS is being jammed, then it's problematic.
So let me again invite our audience to pose any questions they have. I see a question from Al Berlinberg about the difference between jamming and spoofing, which I think we touched on already. I guess let me also ask, it seems like there's different GPS systems out there. I guess GPS is specifically the American system. There's a European system. There's the Chinese have their own. Are these, as we get to a world that is maybe more and more competitive between the West and China, are these systems going to be segregated or sort of walled off between users, or is there sort of risks in one system being used against another, or are they going to remain sort of global and globally accessible?
Well, Guns can probably comment on that one as well. So my understanding is, yes, there are competitors out there to GPS, and it's costing them a lot of money, but also that it allows them not to rely on the U.S. GPS because our GPS system is controlled by the Department of Defense in the U.S. We can also control the signals, and there was some concern if countries are reliant upon the U.S. provided signals, could we alter those things? Could we deny that to users out there? And so that's one of the reasons that there's proliferation in GLONASS and Galileo and other things. So they're not reliant on a U.S. provided system. I think the direction that we're seeing aircraft and a lot of more advanced systems go in is be a receiver that can handle all of those signals. Don't say, hey, we're only a GPS, or we're only a GLONASS, or we're only Galileo. I welcome, with a Kalman filter, algorithm that can evaluate, take in all the signals, add that to your navigation solution along with your INS solution, and that's probably the direction that folks will go in. Now, remember, countries will always reserve the right for their own mil-spec signal out there, right? The Chinese will do that with theirs, which is they're entitled to do, and certainly, we have ours. And so, but that's the way for as far as the commercial application, I would see use of all those signals and then comparing them in case there is, deviations in what's being received.
Great. Well, I think with that, we'll probably wrap up. General Guastella, General Bergeson, thank you so much for your insights today. Thank you to the audience who joined us. We'll actually be having another webinar tomorrow with our Israeli generals Yaakov Amadror and Norkin to discuss the latest situation in Israel and Gaza, where it seems like an extended pause in operations is going to continue as more hostages are released. So please join us for that. And as always, check out our latest analysis and commentary at jinsa.org. Generals, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, Blaze. Pleasure. Thank you very much.
There you go.